Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 23rd paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige. The title being War is always a serious means for a serious object. Its more particular definition. The text follows. Such is war, such the commander who conducts it, such the theory which rules it. But war is no pastime, no mere passion for venturing and winning, no work of a free enthusiasm. It is a serious means for a serious object. All that appearance which it wears from the varying hues of fortune, all that it assimilates into itself of the oscillations of passion, of courage, of imagination, of enthusiasm, are only particular properties of these means. The war of a community, of all nations and particularly of civilized nations, always starts from a political condition and is called forth by a political motive. It is therefore a political act. Now, if it was a perfect, unrestrained and absolute expression of force, as we had to deduct it from its mere conception, then the moment it is called forth by policy, it would step into the place of policy, and as something quite independent of it would set it aside, and only follow its own laws, just as a mine at the moment of explosion cannot be guided into any other direction than that which has been given to it by preparatory arrangements. This is how the thing has really been viewed hitherto. Whenever a want of harmony between policy and the conduct of a war has led to theoretical distinctions of the kind. But it is not so, and the idea is radically false. War in the real world, as we have already seen, is not an extreme thing which expends itself at one single discharge. It is the operation of powers which do not develop themselves completely in the same manner and in the same measure, but which at one time expend sufficiently to overcome the resistance opposed by inertia or friction, while at another they are too weak to produce an effect. It is therefore, in a certain measure, a pulsation of violent force, more or less vehement, consequently making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly. In other words, conducting more or less quickly to the aim, but always lasting long enough to admit of influence being exerted on it in its course, so as to give it this or that direction, in short, to be subject to the will of a guiding intelligence. If we reflect that war has its root in a political object, then naturally this original motive which called it into existence should also continue the first and highest consideration in its conduct. Still, the political object is no despotic lawgiver on that account. It must accommodate itself to the nature of the means, and though changes in these means may involve modification in the political objective, the latter always retains a prior right to consideration. Policy, therefore, is interwoven with the whole action of war, and must exercise a continuous influence upon it, as far as the nature of the forces liberated by it will permit. So, this is another extraordinary chapter that starts being fundamentally a summary of all the considerations that we have made up to now. And in fact, we are heading effectively towards the end. The first chapter has 28 paragraphs, so this is the 23rd. And von Clausewitz is drawing these conclusions that, as we have seen, derive in the previous paragraphs, passing from the theoretical to the concrete, or to the abstract, from the abstract to the real, and observing, as a matter of fact, what war is in reality, because this is von Clausewitz's intention. That's the only type of war von Clausewitz is effectively interested in. He has spent now this consistent part of his work now, more than 1/10, to set the basis of the essentials, the fundamentals, of the conception of war, and however very gradually really getting away from them in terms of distance, considering what happens in real war, for which this is always tied to the conception, but it's still modified by several other factors that, in fact, in these paragraphs are very thoroughly explained and conceived. The title is interesting, considering especially in one of the previous paragraphs that had insisted on the concept of game, that war is a game. War is a very serious game, as we have said also explaining the previous paragraphs, that here von Clausewitz kind of reasserts that explicitly by showing us that war is not, and we'll just read it because it's this is what we're here for. So the title, war is always a serious, means for a serious object. It's more particular definition. So he says, such is war, such the commander who conducts it, such the theory which rules it. So here it's still referring to the previous considerations of how fundamentally war is has this amount of uncertainty, of unknown, that human nature is instinctively attracted towards, and it's effectively to make us consider war not just as a rational action, but actually most of the times as something guided by very irrational forces, at least, that naturally have to be mitigated with reason, and they are, as a matter of fact, but require this kind of emotional side that cannot be excluded from even from a reasonable and prudent attitude when conducting effectively war. Especially in the previous paragraph that here he was continuing to comment on with his first phrase, it emerged, in fact, this kind of daring push that the human mind feels towards danger, in a way or in another, or better towards the unknown. However, something that takes courage, that takes certain qualities like boldness, even, and rashness, that without which work could not effectively work. And because human nature is so here von Clausewitz has reaffirms it, because he doesn't want us to forget it, that we can't conceive war as a purely rational thing, but not even as a largely rational thing. As a matter of fact, you always need several qualities of the mind that are essentially different nature from just reason and prudence and wisdom, etc., and that, however, this same wisdom require in order to transfer fundamentally, intent into action, so idea into action. But having said this, so having showed how sometimes humans are just irrational and do even kind of stupid things, or at least they can in potential, and that this war is effectively a game, both objectively and subjectively, here von Clausewitz says something that we also should never forget, that war is no pastime. It's not a mere passion for venturing and winning, no work of a free enthusiasm. It is, as a matter of fact, a serious means for a serious object. This is naturally, self-explanatorily important to assess, because what in the previous paragraphs we have been acquainted to is just to the let's say irrenunciability, I don't know whether this word exists of not, of the emotional / irrational element in war. But this doesn't mean that it should be the case. I mean, preferably as a mere conception and abstraction, war should tend toward reason, right? I mean, the decisional process and the action should be conducted with a certain degree of awareness, a certain, knowledge of reality, so abilities of assessment and prudence, etc., and cold calculation in theory. Von Clausewitz has wanted to tell us that effectively never happens in full, and most of the times it actually goes in another direction. Also because aside from the decisional process that usually is kind of more rational, because effectively Wu leads in the army is deputed to have this more, this colder mindset and ability of decision than Wu effectively fights on the field in the first line. But the idea is that this irrationality is always framed in something extremely serious, so something that makes you think forcefully, that you're not into because you just wanted to have fun. Let's eradicate once for all this idea that wars are fought just because some crazy person decides that, and beyond that there is nothing else. It's never been so historically, because historically there's never been, not even in the worst totalitarianism, just one person effectively deciding all that had to happen. There is always a political, social, sometimes even military resistance. Think about, I don't know, the Soviet army during Operation Bagration. That was actually 1944, the moment of highest power of Stalin, and yet the Stavka was effectively thinking about taking Stalin out, simply because in that case of the incredible sheer number of human losses that the advance against the Nazis was entailing for the Soviet troops. So war is also no mere passion. It's not just a feeling like I want to cover myself into glory, so I venture there just to win. No, it doesn't work like that. Well, this is interesting also in an historical perspective, because there is a kind of a dramatization of history that is very much fashionable in nowadays, for which there is always the egomaniacal commander that surely most of the time seems to be a general you have to be, but that stops there. That mistakes are just gross misunderstanding, misunderestimations, because someone was consumed by passion. There are definitely generals who, get a tunnel vision, that are not so good, like, they had to be. Just think about Lee at Gettysburg, or it's plenty of examples where there are even, those who have to make things right, do something consistently inconvenient and make a pretty big mistakes. But war is not a mere passion. Indecision in war doesn't stand for that. There is still a faction of a factor of attrition. We'll see that later in the same paragraph, that comes to control and modify the action. That is not even military, but is chiefly political, as we will see. War is no work of a free enthusiasm. Work doesn't break out just because, okay, let's all go to war. It's way more than that. Propaganda sometimes can make you, can make it sound like that, right? Saying, the country was so silly because it went at war, in a war it couldn't win and eventually lost. They were a bunch of idiots. Well, it doesn't work like that, historically speaking. First of all, because you don't kid with propaganda effectively. It's structured exactly to do that, to convince that someone of things that would not be normally believed. But secondly, there are so many other factors that brought to war in that occasion. You may think, I don't know, that World War I was a stupid idea. Well, it was not a stupid idea. It was not even a smart idea, but it was still something that was triggered by some mechanisms that were fueled by so many interests and ideas and expectations, etc., that had their raison d'être in many ways, that brought to that conclusion. And it's particularly difficult to even frame that historically, I mean, to scope it and to say, okay, well, this was the prevailing factor. There are many problems in order to assess it. War is, more properly, a serious means for a serious object. Therefore, and here the word you should stress is serious. It is serious because war is, in fact, something terrible. You don't go out there to die for no reason. We have been commenting very frequently how war is fundamentally most of the times an anti-instinctual action. It's effectively driven by reason. Many detractors, like culturalists, von Clausewitz, like culturalists and other crazies out there, believe that war is effectively just an act of sheer passion that is unleashed without no reason. That actually only the most violent and stupid and primitive people do, because war is such a stupid idea. Well, it's completely the opposite way. War is something extremely serious. Who goes into war knows it's gonna go to die potentially. It's gonna go to lose even. Let's go beyond human life. Let's talk about the fate of entire generations of the entire planet. Just think about Cold War. So something that is even greater than the individual, that is humanity in many ways. Whoever goes to war knows this, and if there are mistakes that are done because it seems that going to war, that decision to go to war was too harsh or too quick, rashly. I don't know whether this is the adjective actually. Well, but you understand what I mean. It was too daring and too uncalculated, etc., miscalculated. So there are still reasons there, and you have to count the odds. We have been reading in the previous paragraphs how the odds come to as a calculation to define the action, and how odds are always kind of uncertain, for which generally countries do not really go at war with each other if they're going they're gonna be slaughtered effectively. There is the rhetoric of the lost cause, which is this romantic perspective that the proud and spirited country goes to war because it's so ingenuous and naive and romantic and etc. No, ingenuous means another thing in English. Well, so naive, so let's say, and then the terrible element of war that takes over. These are narratives that you find pretty much around, like especially for World War I and all these wars that create problems for political narratives to be explained out of this kind of emotional mindset. It's never like that. Humans have been making war constantly for millennia, and everybody knows what war is. Nobody has ever thought that war is something easy in itself, that things can't go wrong, that everything would be so happy, and it's not the case. It's not even the case of World War I, as a matter of fact. Even if you add to that all the irrationality, the nationalistic hatred and arrogance and presumption, etc., it's not like that, because who was at the top had basically calculated lots of things, even with kind of lot of even generations of studying that effectively proved to be wrong. And in that case, there was a problem fundamentally with the doctrine, but not really with the idea that war is easy, or it's supposed to. In the case of World War I, just to stick to that example, yeah, they thought that like in 2 or 3 months from the outbreak, things would have been settled, the war would have been done. It would have been brutal, but kind of quick. Then it lasted for years, but they weren't thinking really like, we will win effectively, because everybody knew that war is a place where you can get defeated, and with all the terrible consequences of the case that already at the time in mass society were considered as in all their more massive weight, if anything, for economical calculation, right? War is a serious means for a serious object. You go there to kill other people. You go there to do things that are gonna effectively have an echo, are gonna be resounding, are gonna change history. As a matter of fact, not necessarily for the better overall. It might be, you know, advantageous for you at the moment, but still, it's something pretty heavy that can sign, you know, that can bring you, can make you so many other enemies. Well, now we're kind of making relativism to make examples that can fit the situation, but definitely nobody goes to war just thinking that it's like a picnic, just for making another silly example. It's really something serious, and everybody is aware of that. Then it says, von Clausewitz says, all that appearance which it wears from the varying hues of fortune, all that it assimilates into itself of the oscillations of passion, of courage, of imagination, of enthusiasm, are only particular properties of these means. So this is also a very powerful phrase, especially after the paragraph, the immediately previous paragraphs to the 23rd, because von Clausewitz had spent actually quite a deal of words to show how, in fact, varying hues of fortune, the oscillations of passion, of courage, of imagination, of enthusiasm, can effectively bring you to this realm of danger and peril, in which you feel somewhat attracted to by instinctually, you know. And we know this from psychology. I mean, human minds are attracted by the mess. You know, they like to have everything kind of stored, treasured, enough resources, but they are automatically attracted, curiously speaking, by where chaos exists. Well, war is pretty chaotic in itself. It's possibly one of the most chaotic human activities ever. But here von Clausewitz refreshes our mind, saying, yeah, okay, there are all these things, right? But these are only particular properties of the means of war, that war has fundamentally. So you can take into consideration, but these are in fact certain elements that are there, but the overall picture is still something very serious, something very dramatic. So that they play a part into it, but the world still remains dominated by the idea that if you went to war, it was because of actually a very serious problem. And always remember the opening line in von Clausewitz's Vom Krige. That war is a duel. War is nothing but a duel on a large scale. So if you have difficulties to picture what von Clausewitz is saying here, just always you know, narrow it down to what can happen to you individually when you have a you know, a fight with someone for whichever reason, and takes into consideration for you how serious in fact the reasons are to have gone into that, to have come to that fight, because most of the times that's not what you want to do. It's definitely something you would gladly do without, but sometimes you can't do, and you can do it, but you can understand from that specific example that there are kind of silly reasons for fighting, but still, when you get into that, it's something that is driven more than by just passions, flame. This, from an individual, at an individual level, is perhaps less intuitive to understand, because effectively the wars of entire communities, of nations, as we will see now in the following phrase, are effectively something more rationalized, more abstract. There is a decisional process that is definitely colder. It can be fueled, it can be, let's say, supported by the primitive, the primordial passions of the people, etc., of the masses especially, not much of the individuals in themselves. But at the end of the day, it's more rationalized, it's more calculated, also because, in fact, who is in charge politically has means that are kind of more effective means of assessment than what the individual can have. But here the example was meant to emphasize the seriousness of the act of violence that war is. So before you engage into an act of violence, you have to have pretty serious means. If you're not a psychopath who can't distinguish emotions basically, and is capable of killing at cold blood just because, why not? Healthy-minded human beings are effectively are brought to violence for extremely serious reasons, on average, on overwhelming average. So this is not something you can just ignore, and it's very useful to make you understand what here von Clausewitz was meaning by serious means for a serious object. Then he goes on. Now this period is long, but well, okay, let's go bit by bit. So here it says the war of a community of world nations, and particularly of civilized nations, always starts from a political condition and is called forth by a political motive. Here von Clausewitz makes once again this example of the nations, let's say the civilized nations, specifically, that really has nothing. I mean, I would like to study more in depth von Clausewitz, thoughts on what he really means by this. At this time, historically, there was this kind of pretty clear distinction between advanced, now even almost fully industrialized nations, to and the kind of more primitive peoples like hunter and gatherers and that still existed out there. So von Clausewitz stresses this dichotomy, not actually because he is particularly interested in the thing. It's actually a relative concept that he uses to make us understand how what we had just previously said about the rationalization, let's say, that happens in the political at a political level when wars are taken. So it's obvious that a nation state of the 19th century, like where von Clausewitz was writing from, had an idea that or borning nation state at least, that war is effectively decided on a basis of several factors that are calculated, brought together, and therefore war is politically decided. There is there are mechanisms for which war breaks out on the basis of political decisions. When you think about the what von Clausewitz calls the savages, with the language of that time, so think about tribesmen, primitive peoples, primitive societies that fight in this way, that effectively own a much higher war-like ethos than the, at least individually inhabitants and individual human beings, than civilized nations. It appears as if wars could break out for more mere act of passion, like I get that where there is no political decisional process. This is an approximation that, once again, he's using just to make us understand how effectively politics is more clearly intelligible as the leader of war in this case in the Western world at that point in history. But it can be easily explained, even in Clausewitzian terms, for these primitive peoples as a political choice, because effectively tribes do not have a a real political body as we intended from our modern perspective. But still, every action makes a fundamentally something political in itself. So even in tribes, there is an equilibrium, there is a balance, there is a chieftain, there are the warriors, there is a distribution of wealth in some cases. So this brings to certain actions that, even if apparently seem relatively simple, and where maybe tribesmen go to war because they look at the stars or the moon or what happens, and just base their actions on this, because they still haven't rationalized the military action consciously, at least, because it still corresponds to certain functions that are very difficult for us to understand, but that effectively are useful in that society, and serve the purpose actually of making communities remaining together. They also have this political decisional process, right? That can stem sometimes from just the pride of that warrior that feels his honor to have been stained and therefore seeks revenge, etc. That's still a political act, if you want, because it's framed still in that society that has its own politics. So von Clausewitz here is not meaning anything so tranchant, like saying there are just civilized nations and uncivilized nations. It actually happens in all the same way. In fact, he writes the war of a community, and then he says of world nations, and particularly of civilized nations. So here he definitely uses the term nation for even peoples that think about, I don't know, the ancient world, the word nations in the Latin meaning of the term, etc. It's clear what he means, right? There is a decisional process, and it happens also among the uncivilized ones. So here it's actually an absolute statement, but it's this division is still didactically meant to make us understand more clearly in comparison what he's talking about. The war, says, of a community always starts from a political condition. So war, in fact, can't be just what he said before, this act of passion, of courage, of imagination, of enthusiasm, is still something that communities, that human beings as social beings, take extremely into consideration. We don't live as isolated monads that we just want to kill one guy or another. We still, there are still our families, our group, our clan, wherever we live in, and this is gonna affect, in fact, the community. Our individual behavior even is gonna influence the community, not less in this sense as the political decision of a head of state of the 21st century in West, say. So, and it's called and war not only starts from a political condition, but it's also called forth by a political motive. So war is not just being started officially by politics, like shooting the gun, here we go, boom, the war starts just because the reason is we just wish to the thirst of glory and stuff like that. There are other political motives that are also usually pretty serious, whichever they are. They can naturally be gloved by propaganda, by ideologies and so on, but still there are way more structural reasons. That's why you can't explain wars just saying just by blaming individuals in this sense. There is a disgusting practice that is very widespread today. It's just saying that soldier was fighting for that country, and it doesn't matter whether that country was a totalitarianism, because it was just brought to war on the points of the bayonet, and after all he was fighting for his own country. But it doesn't mean anything, because at this point the value of resistance is effectively annihilated. What's for? Just a guy that decides, I have to kill, civilians en masse, and I do it because after all I'm a soldier fighting for my own country. It doesn't make any sense. So this idea of blaming just the guy up the top, the tyrant, like, this is a historical, this is a political feeling that belongs to several countries in the world today. And not all of them, and not even just in the West, have them. So it's kind of interesting, but it's not the case. Wars are effectively fought by large by political bodies in large communities that, in this sense, all share their own responsibility, because effectively what every single individual does makes the difference. So even if you have very compelling means of control of societies, etc., like in dictatorships and totalitarianisms, etc., you still do not fight just because you're the guy at the top and just throws the dice and says, okay, let's invade France instead than Russia. Just for instance, there is still some very important reason. There is the military, there is the political representatives that also are in control of society in some way, that have therefore personal interests. They have different views, they have different even different properties. In this sense, they are in charge of different parts. So this political body is extremely complicated, and it doesn't just work because one guy says it. That guy's leadership can be determinant. Like, I don't know, Hitler invades Poland, 1939. Well, yeah, that was part, but in that case, in fact, that was determinant but not decisive, because the decisiveness came from the whole, history in that case of Nazi Germany, or in pre-Nazi Germany, and lots of stories of industrial, economical, social factors that had brought to that, and had brought that guy to power, that had legitimated it. So the fairy tale that it's all because of that guy, no, it's because of the fault of millions that effectively decided that to happen and backed the crazy guy. And I find honestly disgusting how much this is being forgotten in Europe, and how much we're going back to tribalism in this sense, because it's first of all, it's a shame naturally for the dignity of human intelligence, but not only, it's effectively going against what von Clausewitz said. And well, okay, the first reason is more important, but in general, von Clausewitz follows with, a rightfully human intelligence, and he is telling things that effectively explain to us how the whole thing really is. Then, if you don't want to listen, go out there and see what happens. That said, here von Clausewitz says more simply that war is therefore a political act. Now, it's very interesting because you can make equations now with all the things von Clausewitz says. We've said that war is a duel on a large scale, war is an act of violence, war is a political act. So here it follows that acts of violence are political acts. And they kind of always are. I mean, it's not a matter, it's like, just think about, well, now I don't want to digress too much, but you understand that hate is normally fueled by something. Even when you find the crazy guy that goes out there and shoots 30 people, it's usually not because, his brain just went nuts at that moment. It's usually something premeditated. It's usually something fueled by hatred, by ideas, by the ideologies, but of some sort. This is the history of violence in the world. It's always been like that, and therefore it's correct. War is a political act as much as it is an act of violence. Then von Clausewitz goes on, he says, now, if it was a perfect unrestrained and absolute expression of force, we're talking about war, as we had to deduct it from its mere conception, then the moment it is called forth by policy, it would step into the place of policy, and as something quite independent of it, would set it aside, and only follow its own laws, just as a mine at the moment of explosion can be guided into any other direction than that which has been given to it by preparatory arrangements. Very long phrase, but the juice of it is the following. Now, von Clausewitz talks about this, let's once again reconsider, as we were doing at the beginning of the chapter, that war was really something perfect, unrestrained, an absolute expression of force. Then, so this conception, a mere conception, that von Clausewitz in the previous chapters has effectively debunked, or better, proved in its actual non-absolute, of which von Clausewitz has proved its it's actually solute, not absolute character. It's restrained character. It's imperfect character, right? Well, if this was the case, so if really war was just this unrestrained act of violence, then the moment in which it is called forth by policy would step into the place of policy. So it would say basically the act of violence in itself, the pure expression of passion, of emotion, whatever you want to call it, would effectively take away the political decision. Or in other words, fundamentally, all the rationality of war would be taken away, and would be, war would be an act of pure emotion, a pure enmity, a pure hostility. Go back, see the previous paragraph. That's where the first paragraph of the chapter. That's what he had proposed to start, eventually debunking it, and demonstrating the contrary ex absurdo. In fact, he and he makes this equation, this metaphor, in which it basically war is compared to a mine that basically explodes at the given moment, and cannot be guided towards a particular direction. The claimers do not do that, because claimers are effectively mines that, in fact, by preparatory arrangements, explode and throwing the shells all in one direction, so that you can effectively blow the guy in front of you. If you are from the other side, you won't get scratched. This is important, because here von Clausewitz is equating the preparatory arrangements for which the mine will explode to politics. And the explosion to the act of violence, pure and crude, let's say, in itself. And why does it make this metaphor? Because it's saying, if you were to assume that war is this completely irrational thing, then it couldn't be effectively even delivered in reality. Why? Well, he has demonstrated it paragraph by paragraph, the main reason being that, if you don't have a direction, if you don't have an aim, if you don't have a, as a matter of fact, if you have a finite amount of resources, if there are other factors that intervene, if you have someone reacting from the other side that fights you back and, puts you in trouble, well, you can't unleash war like that, because it's physically impossible, actually. So, and what is astonishing is the consideration it makes afterwards, because he says this is how the thing has really been viewed hitherto. whenever a want of harmony between policy and the conduct of war has led to theoretical distinctions of the kind. So, in other words, here von Clausewitz has a polemical intent towards those theorists who had detached politics from war, pretending that fundamentally war is something that once it breaks out, fundamentally has kind of a military environment on its own, that which is true actually, and also von Clausewitz recognizes it, I mean it assesses it, but that is completely unrestrained, it's completely undetached from politics. And von Clausewitz here says it is never the case, because war is always controlled and modified by politics at all times. There is not a single general that can expect just purely military means to be the ones to settle that conflict, that dispute. It never happens. It never happens. And this is not a matter of saying, you know, but let me look in history. No, there is not. Because it's not a matter of decision, of something that's been established by someone. It's something that happens in this way for our mental and physical limits, and there is no other way to make it. And so if you missed the other chapters, go reading them, because that's where von Clausewitz explains to you why it is the case. That this entire chapter is dedicated to it. So you have the playlist on Schwerpunkt, you can read it all. Listen to it all. You can also read it. Hopefully you should read von Clausewitz in German if if it is possible, because I've been advocating it for long, and translations can be tricky sometimes. So, but this is effectively important. Now we don't have time to explain this to explain what the theory of war was at this point, but it's nevertheless important that von Clausewitz here, with the Vom Krige, recognizes the ineliminable tie between politics and war, and especially the overwhelming importance of politics over war at all times, in spite of its reciprocal relation that he will explain in this paragraph. Going on, but it is not so, and the idea is radically false. We have seen it. So it's radically false. It's not something that just you can spot on the surface. Maybe, you know, it is a problem of roots. This is how war is effectively waged and starts and carried on and finished as well, and ended, say better. Then he continues and says, war in the real world, as we have already seen, is not an extreme thing which expands itself at one single discharge. Not at all. It is the operation of powers which do not develop themselves completely in the same manner and in the same measure, but which at one time expand sufficiently to overcome the resistance opposed by inertia or friction, while at another they are too weak to produce an effect. So war doesn't have this extreme expansion at one single discharge, as if you shot a bullet, because it never, you know, it doesn't happen like that, not even real with guns, as a matter of fact. You can understand better, you know, it could happen with men, it doesn't. So here von Clausewitz defines war as the operation of powers which do not develop themselves completely in the same manner and in the same measure. So here it's interesting, the view of different powers actually. It's the operation of powers. So here I don't think he's even taking into consideration the two parties that are fighting, but actually the different powers that exist within the same fighter, right, that has to set them in motion in a way or another, so that they can't rely just on one element, but still on a sum of elements. So these elements do not develop themselves completely, first of all, nor in the same manner and in the same measure. So it's like with a gun. Just to make an example, brutal example, but I mean a brutally approximate example. I mean, you're a soldier, you're out there, you have a gun, there are enemies around, but still you don't shoot, just for the sake of it. You have to wait for the enemy to be spotted first of all, and to have to take an aim, to have to start firing from a favorable position, hopefully not get shot in the process back, not to shoot yourself, which can also effectively happen, not to do many other things, that therefore, you have the potential of your gun, you have that magazine fully loaded and ready to be shot, but are you shooting it at only 1 second? No, you're not. It even takes time to shoot rounds, and that's the point. That's what Clausewitz is telling you. This is not a matter of opinion. This is how physics works. It can be, I try to narrow it down to this relatively secondary aspects, but just think of these secondary aspects effectively making up the whole thing, the whole combat, the whole war. And these factors are partly also the inertia and the friction that exists in our world. These are physical factors as well. So you see that these are not meant just physically, but this is meant even spiritually. I mean, in terms of moral forces, etc. And so it says sometimes they're sufficiently strong to they expand in a sufficient way to make that act of violence breaking out effectively. Let's say that the soldier there effectively pulled the trigger and shot someone and managed to attack. Sometimes this doesn't happen. Remember the paragraphs on the suspension of action? Well, that's what we're talking about. There are moments, even in the same war, in what we call as war, that to which effectively the motives for which you have to shoot, for which you have to carry out that act of violence, are too weak because to produce an effect, because at that moment there are other factors that are effectively preventing you from making them, because it would also be anti-economical. So this, I think, makes it relatively clear. Then he goes on, he says, it is therefore, in a certain measure, a pulsation of violent force, more or less vehement, consequently making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly. And we stop here for now. So here it basically repeats what we just said. There is this pulsation of violent force that can be more or less vehement, and therefore, so here you realize the potential and the effective, right, and the action. There is a violent pulsation, right, but it can be more or less vehement, which means you're angry, but you're not necessarily you're gonna wait, because you want to wait the right moment to blow the brains of your enemy up. So it's these are the factors. So consequently, this pulsation making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly. So it's not always the same thing going on at the same time in one shot, or even a brief time, or in the same rhythm. No, it always changes. It's always different. There's not a single war that is equal to another. There's not a single army that is equal to another. Hell, there is not even a single weapon that is equal to another, but more especially, there is not a single human being that is equal to another on this earth. Not even one. Better, not even two. Okay. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, in other words, conducting more or less quickly to the aim, but always lasting long enough to admit of influence being exerted on its course, so as to give it this or that direction, in short, to be subject to the will of a guiding intelligence. Here we see the guiding factor, what von Clausewitz calls it rightfully not just a leader, but effectively a guiding intelligence that makes it not just sound better, but also more realistic. So this guiding intelligence has this power of effectively conducting this the act of violence more or less quickly to the aim, but it also has an aim. So it has always this, you know, calibrated influence on that or better, it exerts in itself a more or less intense, let's say better, a lesser or greater influence on the course of the action, and it gives it different directions. So a war has never the same aim of the beginning, because in the meanwhile things change. So even it may seem to you like, I don't know, that country made a war to fight, I don't know, to take that region, right? But it never, you know, still the costs and benefits that the fighter had assumed to be there varied in the meanwhile. Wars could be effectively stopped because the was started them doesn't have an interest anymore to continue them. Most wars actually work like that. They not work because, you know, effectively one side is annihilated by the other. Most wars are this kind of, you know, biting that little part here, eroding that other part there, strengthening a little bit there, and it's always this calibrated game, because humans are tendentially cautious to risk everything in one shot, not even when it would be convenient, because there is this tendency to postpone the extreme exertion of forces, even. So it's not even just a matter of odds, but it's effectively, you know, the odds come to push you eventually to decide that, but still there's this one of those attrition factors that von Clausewitz has explained, is that tendentially, you know, we're lazy. And that's why at the end of the day it's not even strength the most important thing, but intelligence, because intelligence gives you by itself motives, in fact, and directions and aims, etc. So that's what here von Clausewitz is talking about. And guess what intelligence here stands for? We'll see now. So he goes on and says, if we reflect that war has its root in a political object, that von Clausewitz has already stated at the beginning of the work, then naturally this original motive which called it into existence should also continue the first and highest consideration in its conduct. So here, in other words, to make the long story short, it's saying politics not just makes it start, as we were saying before, and stops there, and then war is unleashed in a violent manner, but politics keeps guarding it. Politics effectively controls war and conducts it itself. So he goes on, he says, still, the political object is no, this is particularly important, still, the political object is no despotic lawgiver on that account. It must accommodate itself to the nature of the means, and though changes in these means may involve modification in political objective, the latter always retains a prior right to consideration. So here it's a beautiful, this is a very beautiful phrase because it explains the reciprocity that exists between war and policy. Von Clausewitz has defined, it will reassert, especially in the following paragraph in 24, that has as a title, "War is a mere continuation of policy by other means." So the most famous Clausewitzian phrase. And here, however, he tells us something more. He tells us that it is true, war is a mere continuation of policy by other means. It's policy that conducts war. Who else? There is not a war suspending in the air that works by itself, not even when you start that. It's not like a fire that burns it by itself. Well, the fire actually burns if there is enough oxygen, if there is something effectively that burns. But more than that, politics controls and modify war in its conduct because it's effectively leading it itself. But in this sense, politics, or better, the political object, which it's kind of interchangeable in my opinion in this case, but here the fact that that von Clausewitz poses the emphasis on the political object is stressing the fact that political objects change, so that politics, in other words, is not about, you know, a being, like, I am policy, I like doing just this thing. No, politics changes, and political objects vary. So, more political object before resorting to the instrument of war as its continuation is not someone says, you know, you now do just what I say, and I don't care where you find the means. Politics in itself takes into consideration, obviously, what are the means of war. It's no despotic lawgiver in this sense, because it must accommodate itself to the nature of the means. In other words, if you are the state of Liechtenstein, well, you know, you may, you know, want to destroy, I don't know, Germany. But, you know, it's kind of a bit difficult to do it objectively, so that in that case, the political objective of Liechtenstein should be effectively, you know, maybe mitigated. Maybe, you know, Liechtenstein will always think about destroying Germany, but with great difficulty, at least in current situation, could effectively happen. Sorry, Liechtenstein, I just used you to throw this example out, but it didn't mean anything. But it is. And so, in other words, and this is a very complex problem. Just think about when Nazi Germany invaded, and its her allies invaded the Soviet Union. Well, oceans of inks have been written about whether Operation Barbarossa could effectively be a success. My opinion is that it couldn't, and that the Germans basically lost it all on their own. Then obviously there is the blame of saying, you know, their allies were betrayed, the allies were, you know, so no. If you go counting the numbers on the Eastern Front and you realize how grossly underestimated how grossly the Germans had underestimated the Soviet forces, you realize that there was a pretty serious problem. That there were ways actually to win, but they were all based on the Eastern Front. Well, in that case, it's kind of a good example. There are others during World War II, all involving in that case Hitler and the Wehrmacht, and saying what were the political objects and were the actual effective means that that could be employed, because some things were impossible, and some and this is not just a case of this specific example, but one of the greatest problems is the assessment. What is that you want to do, in fact, and do you have, this is the critical question that Von Clausewitz in military history, do you have the means to achieve it, to obtain it, but that's one of the greatest problems of every commander-in-chief, of everybody. It doesn't matter here being a chief of state or a general on the field. You have to assess what the reality of your means is, but your limits are in other ways. But it's extremely complicated, and von Clausewitz wrote the wall Vom Krige exactly to explain to you how you can't basically figure it out easily or completely or fully, not even when things are over, not even after centuries of analysis, etc. But there are ways that help you at least getting closer to it. So definitely one of them is, first of all, not to think that war basically works by itself. In other words, when you have to win a war, just to make it very brutally simple, you can't just look at how banally how many troops you have and how much the enemy has, because there are conditions in which even if you are superior in number, things may gonna go seriously bad, and that's pretty evident. But not even when you have an overwhelming force, you can just say, okay, well, there are wars where you have a huge advantage, but still the enemy is so resilient, the conditions are so tough, they keep getting worse, much worse than what you expected, that effectively at that point you may even win, but maybe you don't have the interest anymore to keep on fighting as you previously thought before. That's all it takes. That's normally how great powers are defeated or meant to be defeated. It's like the American Civil War. If you look at the industrial power, was all concentrated in the United States, was all concentrated in the North. What does the Confederacy could do? Well, the Confederacy could say we can inflict so many losses to the Union that at that specific moment we can make them withdraw from the war, and they're effectively sitting on a table and listening to our thing. Or the same with the Vietnam War. It's not that the United States didn't have the potential to wipe out the North Vietnam, but they couldn't fully use it for many reasons, and sometimes also for kind of moral commitment, like saying the public opinion at a certain point say, okay, we don't support you anymore, etc. So that's all what it takes, and it's not just a few. I mean, it's a few considering the whole sum of factors, but it's definitely not a few in terms of how to achieve it, because it's also in here in terms of odds. Something first of all, you already have to be in certain conditions in order to achieve, and secondly, you may never know effectively, and it's always difficult to overcome a difficult the enemy superiority in many cases. That's the same, I don't know, it's like, think about once again the Eastern Front in World War II. Well, that's a war theater where you realize that even though probably the Axis didn't have enough forces to defeat the Soviet Union, but nevertheless the Soviet Union lost an enormous amount of territory, of men, of material in the first phase of the war that effectively were enormously difficult to recover. Even when they effectively got the upper hand, they turned the tide, and they started pushing the Axis back. So things cost, and they cost overwhelmingly, because this is how physics fundamentally works. It takes a freaking lot of energy in order to achieve certain results, and that energy is not, immediately expandable. That's what von Clausewitz is telling us now, effectively. There are still lots of things that, by the way, require other extra energy to be enacted that will effectively complicate, if not overcomplicate, in fact, in terms of your aim, your object. And but particularly important is the last period. It says the latter always retain. I mean, the latter meaning the political object always retains a prior right to consideration. So in other words, policy is always superior to war. Policy is always superior to war. In this sense, it's the most important factor. Which means that, yeah, policy controls war when it's fought, but things start, let's assume, going wrong into war, so policy at that point say, okay, we bail out of this, and therefore it's still policy deciding it. And it's still, using other weapons, fundamentally. So other means that may be, diplomatic, for instance, and not violence. But effectively, well, also in this, it's not diplomacy. Diplomacy in itself is just a tool. Once again, it's still a matter of forces involved. That makes the difference even in politics. So that there are wars that are never fought because it simply takes, to absorb economically one country just to make it say whatever you like, right? And that's where, in fact, that operation of powers that we're taking into consideration didn't have enough strength to overcome the resistance opposed by an inertia of friction, so that war doesn't break out. So concluding the paragraph with this phrase: policy therefore is interwoven with the whole action of war and must exercise a continuous influence upon it as far as the nature of the forces liberated by it will permit. Here he is reasserting the fact that policy and war are deeply interwoven. It's no novelty for us. And policy especially must exercise a continuous influence upon war, as far as the nature of the forces liberated by it will permit. So this last phrase is dramatic because it basically means that sometimes you can't go back. So in other words, that's why the Nazis invaded Soviet Union in 1941, and in 1945 they had the Soviets in Berlin. So at that point there was not much room left for policy, because it was effectively just a war of annihilation, right? As it had started since the beginning, telling the truth, but policy still played something. Like in the Eastern Front, at one point it was thought by both sides to make peace, especially in 1943. So you see that there are certain it's fluctuating. So here politics can intervene in several ways, but it can also lose it. It can also be overwhelmed by, say, the enemy military forces. At that point you don't have any other mean to just say, okay, we're done, and you have no other mean but to resist. What for? In the case of Nazi Germany, to at least lose the less possible territory to the Soviets and possibly surrendering to the Western Allies. But that's that's policy, in fact, that decided it, because that's effectively where policy decided that, you know, it was imperative to concentrate more troops still on the Eastern Front, where they had always been concentrated, by the way, but also not making a big deal, even in the decision of a single commanders, generals, etc., to surrender more eagerly to the Western Allies and not to the Soviets. Okay, so as I was saying before, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs before the end of the first chapter, and then we will pass to chapter 2, and means in war, which make kind of a interesting thing, because it kind of gets more specific and also kind of more you know, I don't know how much more difficult actually, because it depends on what perspective you're interested in, but it also starts becoming more concrete, like in the face of war discovers itself more clearly. Well, okay, we have still effectively a couple of weeks before that, if everything goes well. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.